Well, it looks like we looks like we might be in business this morning. I am trying to come on, get that to so I don't have any feedback, but it looks like I still do. All right, welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered. This morning, you are listening to me, Jack Stockwell. I'll be here for an hour this morning, and an hour tomorrow morning, and an hour Wednesday morning. Just as a reminder, my Wednesday program has now gone to 8 to 9 a.m., not 7 to 9. I have to cut back on my activity a little bit, and the audience from 7 to 8 on Wednesday is less than a third of what is from 8 to 9. So that's the period I chose. So what I'm doing now will be our update over the last several days, of which there are so many things to talk about, not the least of which was Keir Starmer finally resigning this morning. Was that a surprise? Well, in the words of Alistair Crook, it's a surprise it took this long. He's going to be in there until the next prime minister is chosen. Looks like the guy from South Birmingham will be the next fellow. I can't think of his name out of the moment, but still out of the Labour Party, which means it'll be business as usual. Just like when we get presidential changes in this country, there's a lot of fanfare about what the previous party was doing that was all wrong and what the new party is going to do. And boy, did you ever get sold a bill of goods in the election of 2024. Because it's just the same old thing. Same directive, same momentum, same directive. So what can you expect? I'm kind of a point right now in my political perspective, and I'm just trying to keep my business going. I'm just trying to survive in the marketplace. That's hard enough. Yeah, he may not exactly. Thanks, Paul. He may not leave till August or September, as I was saying. He's not going to leave until the party chooses the next president, or the next prime minister, even though he is resigning. All right, well, a little bit about the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU. I'm sure you've been keeping up with that. It's been hard for me to keep up with it because I've been keeping up with the World Cup. It's just the tremendous, what do you want to call it? People who should be winning are losing. And teams that you would not have expected to do as well as they have been doing against legendary teams are whipping them. America plays again this Thursday. Who are they playing? Is it Ecuador? Who are they playing? But America has made it to the 32. They're doing great. And so, due to two of my sons, Josh and Rourke, they have been able to just greatly increase my interest in soccer, because once they were able to explain the strategies of what's going on the field, because I always thought it was just kicking a ball back and forth in my pathetic ignorance of the game. No, there are tremendous strategies that are being laid out, both defensive and offensive. And once I began to see these strategies unfold in front of you, it's just like American football. When you look at offensive, defensive strategies and how calling audibles and whatever else before the snap can change a complete defensive profile. Once I learned that about soccer or world football, it became much more interesting. But occasionally I would take a look I would watch the news to see what's going on out there. And this new memorandum of understanding between Trump and Pezeshkian. And then Trump, of course, chose the big gala dinner after the the signing at Versailles with Macron, another knucklehead that needs to go, in the famous castle there at Versailles. So this was a historic moment, and it came as a certain surprise because the schedule that was supposed to be signed in Switzerland was suddenly changed. And then there's always the worry and concern of assassination. The Iranians have learned that the Americans have picked up the Israeli program of assassinating your enemies before they can do anything against you. The two previous diplomatic meetings, in the midst of the meetings at Doha, and then where was the other? Was the other one in Tehran? Yeah, Doha and Tehran. In the midst of the negotiators sitting down to come up with some kind of a peace agreement, they were bombed by American Tomahawk missiles. So it's very understandable that the Iranians are very reluctant to meet with Americans unless the real estate people show up. And if Witkoff and Kushner show up at these meetings, who really have nothing to add, except that, they might be able to try to sell some more waterfront property in the new emerging Gaza. At least are their life insurance programs, because it seems like the West might be a little less likely to take them out. But if you look at that and you look at all this, the aspects surrounding this stuff, it's a very important first step, supposed to be followed by a first phase of 30 days, where elements on this, I think it's a 14-point program, have to be hammered out, and then there's going to be a 60-day phase where the agreement is supposed to be finalized. But of course, Iran will not recognize anything that allows Israel to continue attacking Lebanon. And Israel, I don't know if you saw Netanyahu's recent speech, I did, where he said, and he tried to compare Israel to America, that if America was being bombed by nightly, daily rockets and assassination attempts from some pocket of some group of desperate terrorists south of the Rio Grande, how long would it be? Let's say that they were, launching missiles into San Antonio from the Mexican border. How long would it be before America rushed into Mexico with their armed forces to quell the violence and to push the borders back even further and maintain a peacekeeping group? How long would it take America to do that? As though these are comparable, that somehow Hezbollah is killing all of these Israeli citizens. Now, as Larry Johnson pointed out, I thought it was really good. If you will Google this question, how many Israelis has Hezbollah killed since 1982? And you'll come up with about 11,000. If you reverse the question on Google, or ChatGPT or Grok or Claude or something like that, how many citizens has the Israeli army killed in Lebanon and Gaza since 1982? And with the latest round over the last 30 days of what's been going on in Gaza, it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 100,000. So you have 11,000 on one hand, 70 to 100,000 on the other hand. Not exactly comparable figures. Now, I'm not standing behind anybody at this point. I just think it's very interesting how critical information is left out of the analysis. Now, I think one of the most important reasons for this sudden agreement with this MOU was stated by President Trump, actually quite amazingly, very open on the subject, because he said the situation has become desperate. In 4 weeks, practically all oil reserves all over the world are going to run out. Now, when we talk about America's oil reserves running out, it's not 100 million barrels of oil sitting on the ground, waiting to be delivered to a refinery. These cascades, you remember from the movie Dune, if you've seen it, and how the Fremen, in the midst of worst desert conditions, had millions of gallons of water in reservoirs underneath their mountain sieges. It's a siege. Well, what the oil reserves have been for decades in America are these old pockets in salt mines deep underground. And they pump the raw crude down into these vast open salt mines because the salt and the oil will not mix. And they fill these things up. And that's our strategic reserves, where we have hundreds of millions of gallons of crude. And the way you get that out of there is you pump water down into those reserves to cause the oil to float up to the top, because, as you know, fat oils float on water. And then you siphon it off. And then there's a problem of decompression that can take place, because if you suck enough oil out of these areas that have been girding up the underlying strength of these old salt mines, there's a possibility of massive cave-ins. So there's that possibility as well. But we're down to the lowest levels of oil reserves, not just in this country, but all over the world. And what was threatening is this financial crisis like the one in 1929. And that was the big one. And that's the big financial crisis that led to the Depression of the 30s, followed by World War II. And Trump basically said he didn't want to become a second President Hoover. So this sword of Damocles of an absolutely over-bankrupt financial system threatening to blow out was what really put a fire under the butt of a lot of elements in this situation. So it's very clear this is reaching a very, very critical, edgy point. Now, obviously, there are many booby traps in all of this agreement, this memorandum of understanding. The most dangerous one right now is the question of Lebanon, because Iran is ironclad insisting that Lebanon is a part of this agreement, which is why the strait is closed. I think it was just early this morning over in Europe that Vance is saying that the strait is open. Well, that's true and not true. It's open to those who have the secret password. It's not open to those who don't have the password. In fact, if you don't have the password, you're going to be shot out of the water. You're not going to be told where the mines are. And this is why Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. And there has to be an inclusion of Lebanon in this ceasefire. And Israel, on the other hand, is equally determined not to give up its fight against Hezbollah. And just yesterday, there were new Israeli strikes into Lebanon. And 4 IDF soldiers were killed, which led to a rather violent reaction by previous politicians in Israel, reacting to an agreement in general, among them Ben-Gvir, who said that all of Lebanon must burn. He said that yesterday. All of Lebanon must burn. And that for every killed Israeli, 1,000 Lebanese mothers should weep. And other such barbaric language. I mean, Trump doesn't have a monopoly on barbarism or barbaric language. His Israeli Zionist buddies, whether he wants to call them that or not, it's obvious in his relationship with the Israeli government. It's Israel first, not America first. That such barbarism exists today that it has existed in the darkest periods of this planet's history. So that's kind of what the big question is. What will the United States, what will Trump do if Israel does not adhere to the agreement? And Israel is as adamant that they're not going to stop their intrusion into Hezbollah. And here's the interesting thing. Whenever you hear the Israeli leaders talking about defending themselves from Hezbollah, and that they have to move in. And of course, they were never going to go past the Litani River. And now Ben Gvir is saying, we're going to take all of Lebanon, based on the fact that they have to stop Hezbollah's attacks on northern Israel. They never mentioned Greater Israel. They never mentioned the fact that these right-wing lunatics are dedicated to the concept of Greater Israel, which of course includes Lebanon. It includes Syria. It includes almost all of Iraq, except for the Kurd area, and all of Jordan. And that Israel, the Greater Israel, the biblical Israel, terribly misinterpreted, mind you, should have control of all of that land. And that's what they're really after. And so, what is the United States going to do if Israel refuses to comply with Iran's demand to get out of Lebanon? So the ball is clearly in Trump's court right now. And Trump is in a very tense situation because on the one side, it's very clear that there's a very broad front of people right now who are angry about the memorandum of understanding. They don't support the fact that he has agreed to this kind of thing because they'd like to continue the war even if it was completely lost. And they would like the neocons in the Republican Party, the Democrats, many of the financial backers of President Trump, they would like to bring this agreement to a win by bringing it into Congress where it should be voted down. So that's one thing. On the other side, naturally, Trump has to react to his own base, which is very, very upset against him and dwindling as the war has been dragging on because President Trump has promised to be a president of peace. That's one of the reasons why he was voted in a second term. It's one of the reasons why I voted for him. I had my concerns, but I believed he was going to stop all of this activity, and all he had to do was pick up the phone and tell Zelensky, get out of the pool, the party's over. Pick up the phone and call Netanyahu, get out of the pool, the party's over. Go home. That's all he had to do because Zelensky cannot fight without Trump, and Netanyahu cannot fight without Trump. And then this Netanyahu's promise over the weekend that America will be flying wingtip to wingtip with the Israeli Air Force as they regain their attacks on Iran, President Trump at least said, I don't think so. And then you've probably been following all of the outbreaks of President Trump against Netanyahu. I don't know that there's time to save the midterms, but you never know. And if Trump wants to recover the momentum, given the fact that the popularity of Israel in the United States has dramatically vanished because of more and more people becoming aware of the genocide in Gaza and what is now happening in Lebanon, which is essentially a Gaza-type genocide against the Lebanese innocent civilians, and what has been happening in the West Bank, in territory Israel is not allowed to touch, but they've been moving in more and more, pushing out the Palestinians, taking over their homes and businesses. Trump has to somehow make sure that he can get back in the saddle before the midterms. If he wants to have at least the remainder of his presidency in some kind of a position, if he loses both houses, he may not be president past the month of January 2027. Now, one has to look at the situation from the strategic point of view. The fact that all the war aims of two nuclear powers, the United States and Israel, against a country which did not have nuclear weapons, and when compared to the United States, which is the largest military power in the world, can only be called a medium-sized country. Still, it has not been possible to make a regime change between these two nuclear powers and this medium-sized Middle Eastern country, which, excuse me, when all of this finally comes to an end, Iran will be the commanding country in the Middle East. There's no issue about that. But they weren't able to destroy the ballistic missile system. They've not gotten rid of Iran's sovereign right to have peaceful nuclear energy. So, from the standpoint of those who are waging the war, this war has clearly been lost by the war party. The United States and Israel has simply lost this war. The straits are still closed. And Iran is still in permanent control of the Strait of Hormuz, which it was not before. Before the attack back in the end of February, the straits were wide open to anybody. And now Iran's control of the strait is even stronger than ever. And it's turned out that the Strait of Hormuz, or the control of it, is actually a more powerful weapon than the threat of nuclear weapons. Think about it. And that's a big strategic factor, which will go into all the calculations from now on, and it has absolute implication because the United States' influence in the Middle East is clearly diminished and may not be there much longer at all, clearly, and because of the incredible implications of keeping that strait closed. Because the entire security architecture, which was based to a very large extent on the U.S. bases in all of the different Gulf states, turns out to not be an advantage anymore, but a liability because of the way these countries are responding to the previous housing of American bases. Because the U.S. bases are a magnet for Iranian attacks. And the United States has proven not to be able, or both able and willing, to defend their own bases in the host countries. That's why we are pulling servicemen, airmen, seamen out of these bases. Because we're not willing to defend our own bases in these countries. Why? Because of the overwhelming missile drone attack from Iran. Clearly underestimated before this thing broke out. So that naturally brings up the question for these countries, what's the security for them in the future? If the United States closes down, a lot of them they have to close down because the bases have been destroyed. Some of them are still active. But what is the security design for these Gulf states if the U.S. can't provide it? They're going to have to find some arrangement with Iran if they want to get their oil out of the strait, which for geographical reasons, until some massive earthquake changes things, that's going to be there for the indefinite future. And that is why they need to have a new security architecture for the Middle East. Now there's all these kinds of commentators, as you've probably noticed, people who have good intentions, people who are just plain cynical. There are many critics out there who are saying, this is just a charade. There's nothing really behind it. Nothing will ever change. Israel will torpedo the whole thing. And I'm, listening to some of these cynics, that it doesn't bring you one iota forward if you have that kind of a view, of course, because you have to think about how to intervene in history at crucial moments like this to get an improvement, which is why I've been saying for as long as I learned about it 20 years ago from the LaRouche organization, you can't just stop shooting. You have to rebuild. And you have to rebuild in such a way that benefits both sides. And the thing that would benefit both sides more than anything else is this Oasis plan that could turn the entire Middle East into a garden. Now, I'm not going to repeat it here. I talked about it many times, but basically the idea to extend existing corridors like CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, into Iran, into Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and then have another corridor coming in from India all the way to Turkey, extending the north-south transport corridor from St. Petersburg to India, branch it out so that eventually the entire area, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, all countries which have been devastated by previous interventionist wars that we've done to them, or sanctions like the Caesar sanctions in the case of Syria. All these countries are in a dire need to reconnect through reconstruction. And the Gulf states need a new approach whereby they can have a security model where policy towards the common good is being put there as a security policy, because that's the only thing which will give governments long-term security. So if you have Syria and Lebanon, or Syria and Israel, or even Lebanon and Israel sitting down after the shooting stops for whatever reason, what do we have to do to protect each other's back? Like the old Treaty of Westphalia that ended the 150 years war between the Protestants and the Catholics. What do we have to do to stop the shooting and take care of one another? And that lasted for 150 years. So this extended Oasis plan has to be on the agenda. And it definitely includes a gigantic plan for reconquering the desert. Because if you look at the map, practically the entire region from Egypt, the Saudi Peninsula, Iran, even into China, across Pakistan, across India, up into China, up into Western China. It's a huge strip of desert that is growing larger every year. And China, on the other hand, has just demonstrated that they have an incredible ability to transform desert into farmland, into forests, into orchards, into beautiful parks. They produced several videos, many of which I've seen, where they have very sophisticated approach to using drop watering and using all kinds of technologies. And in the beginning, it was very laborious, of course, very expensive. But once you have a certain amount of plant growth, you change weather patterns, developing new rain patterns that you can actually reconquer entire regions. China did it in the Northwest and in the Xinjiang, where in each case they reconquered areas the size of the territory of Germany from quite sizable deserts. And if you take that approach, and to me, this is hopeful. This is great news, great possibilities. And you do that in these corridors that I mentioned, you have long-term perspective, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. You have a perspective that you can transform the entire Southwest Asia into a hub connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe, as it was back in the days of the old Silk Road, where not only goods were exchanged, but philosophy, art, ideas, music, that could be the function of the region again. So, when you look at this memorandum of understanding, Iran's insistence, it includes Lebanon, Israel's insistence, they have a sovereign right to invade Lebanon. Is this going to go on? Will this thing last? Will it be blown apart again? Why not use the opportunity to put a policy on the agenda which definitely brings peace to the region for a very long period of time, and hopefully forever transforming the entire geometry? Now, if you look at the fact that the old order, as it grew after the Second World War, and as it was redefined after the end of the Cold War, when some people prematurely declared that to be the end of history, proceeded to try to establish a unipolar world dominated by the Anglo-Americans, and basically forcing or trying to force the rest of the world to submit to that unipolar world with methods of regime change, color revolutions, interventionist wars, unilateral sanctions, the stuff that Perkins talks about in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And all of that, it not only failed, it's backfired. because it caused a tremendous blowback where the global South countries, they looked at the options. And that's why they never bought into the narrative about the reasons for the Ukraine war, because they looked at the promises given to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze in 1990 that there would be no NATO expansion to the east. And so many documents are now published to prove that this was promised absolutely without any question of doubt. And then 6 times, NATO expanded to the east. And so, of course, with it was the expansion of the European Union. And the European Union, now having 27 members, wants to add another 13, making it for sure the largest imperial expansion ever in history. Well, it hasn't happened. But that was what was declared as a goal in the G7 just last week. So the global South, those countries looked at this and they recognized that this was simply an attempt to reconstruct an imperial neo-colonialist order. And they did not want to have any part of it. They're trying to get out of the last 500-600 years of colonialism that's devastated their countries in the sense of natural resources. And especially because of the rise of China, they've had for the first time an opportunity to have other economic ties besides the IMF and England through the United States and England through the IMF. That way they can develop their own resources, where the full production chain would be made in their own countries instead of having stuff mined, being paid for it, and then that stuff being sent to America for processing or some other country for processing. And they just get a tiny little royalty. Like oil royalties today. Suppose they found oil under your house, and through a series of whatever steps, you were able to put in an oil derrick and start pumping oil. Well, you couldn't afford to do any of that stuff. You don't know how to find it. You don't know how to get it out. You don't know what to do after you get it out. So you have a royalty lease with an oil company that comes in and does it. Do you know what they pay you? 3%, maybe 6% if you're lucky. They take everything else. And so what China is offering these countries who do not want to deal with the West anymore, you keep your stuff. You not only can keep your stuff, we will help you install the technology that develops your natural resources to a saleable form on the world market. What do the Chinese get in return? The chance to go in there, build all this stuff up, and be paid for it, of course, and to be part of a trading community where they can come in then afterwards and buy the finished product from a country whose basic staple behind their trading instruments is gold. They're not tied to a floating exchange rate anymore. Maybe I'm missing something here. But I think this is why so many countries are abandoning the West and moving to this idea that China and Russia and India and South Africa and Brazil are offering these countries through BRICS. So, excuse me, that's all in the background. And both the Ukraine war and the Iran war are related to this. Obviously, they have historical specific reasons, and they have their local reasons, and they have their ethnic cultural reasons, but they're also part of this larger picture where the oligarchical forces in the West want to ruin Russia. I think that's the terms that Merz used, which didn't function, obviously, but that was declared many times and contained China. We're going to ruin Russia. We're going to contain China, which is also not doing well because China has an economic policy which is obviously doing something very right because more nations are joining it. And therefore, China is going to keep growing independent of any problems that they may have on the road. But overall, the Chinese experiment is a wonderful success story. And the countries, and in relation to that success story, an estimated 800 million Chinese citizens have been lifted out of poverty and at worst have middle class jobs now, where they support themselves. Yes, it's a communist country, but even communists understand you want to maintain power, you better make sure you have a happy populace underneath your power structure. And the countries of the global south who are allying with China clearly are the global majority. And that's a fact that nobody can get around, because between the global south and BRICS, making up this global majority, represent 85% of the GDP of this planet. So what needs to be done is that we need to have a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interests of every single country on this planet, not just Wall Street and the City of London's wishes for the raw materials of this planet. And there are proposals already on the table, and I'm not just talking about some utopian thing. If you look at this new white paper that was just published by the Chinese government, discussing how the global governance initiative can be a framework for a new security architecture. And then you take a similar idea coming from a completely different background, and that is the encyclical, this Magnificat Humanitas from the Pope, about the magnificent human species, which is essentially the same thrust that the effort to create a new Tower of Babel has to be replaced by a world where everybody has the right to develop, and the refugee crisis must be overcome by bringing development to the countries where people are running away from it because of poverty and war and disease. But you go back into these countries and you help them develop. This is what China and Russia are offering sub-Saharan African countries. We'll help you build an internal economic development, and we will bring water, power, airports, hospitals, schools, universities, shipyards, train yards to help you develop your interior, because you've got what we want, natural resources that we don't have. And we're not going to do what the West has done under 500 years of colonialism, steal it from you. We're going to help you develop it. In return, we expect to be paid back at a very low interest rate, mind you, but then the ability to trade with you. Because we don't want to trade with the West anymore, because we don't trust the West. And that's going on right now. So in the background, the Ukraine war, the Iran war, all of these things going on to try to stop it. That's why the Ukraine war continues. And President Putin, being a very, very patient man, is now being pushed heavily by his government and his citizens. End this damn war. And then you saw this massive attack against Moscow. That was all publicity. Do you know what those missiles that landed in Moscow were containing? Kerosene. It was a photo op for the West to get money into the Ukraine to continue their efforts to ruin Russia. Those missiles were carrying kerosene. What's kerosene do when it explodes? Tons and tons of black smoke. And so it looked like all of Moscow was on fire. Targets were not strategic, just massive fires from the burning kerosene of these missiles. So someone asked me in an email, why didn't Russia respond to this? Why didn't they just eliminate Kyiv? Because that wasn't what you thought it was. It wasn't a massive drone attack against strategic areas of Russia. It was all for show with the G7 to get them to commit more money to the Ukraine's efforts to ruin Russia. It's all theater. And the Russians continue their advance, one city after another. And now the Pope, and I've been following him, I've been following his speeches, is demanding a complete shift, get this, to love. He's trying to get people to not think in terms of military strategies, peace agreements that aren't going to be followed. He's trying to get them to shift to a culture of love, because that's the only attitude, he says, which will make such a change possible. China, a communist country, is essentially saying the same thing, coming from a Confucian tradition. Remember, most Chinese are Confucianists. That's the correct term. And Confucius famously said, you can decide to feel love at will. You don't have to be coerced into love. You don't have to learn to love. Love is a basic human quality, and you can choose to love. I don't think that's crazy. I think that's absolutely feasible. You can change your emotions. You can become a loving person at will. Now, that doesn't mean you drop your guard. That doesn't mean you dissolve your sovereignty. You just stop shooting at each other. And you sit down and you create a framework that will benefit all of you. And that's why this expanded OASIS plan from the Schiller Institute to connect the entire Western Hemisphere through railroads, through water canals, through hydroelectric power dams. The water's there, you just have to divert it. It's the same thing that Roosevelt wanted to do to the American West back in the 1930s because of the tremendous amount of water that was in Canada, Western Canada. Through canals, bring that water down into Western America. So America could, the desert lands that we have out here can be turned into a rose, to a garden. All you need is water. Well, that never got off the ground because the West, through religious involvement as well as political, didn't want the development of the West to take place. So there was not enough support in Congress for that to happen. But the concept isn't new. It's been around for a long time. And as the American frontier expanded further west, following the revolution, they found out there's a lot of areas that aren't rain dependent because it doesn't rain. So they started building canals. They started building irrigation projects so that once they moved west of the Mississippi, they had to have massive irrigation programs. I wanted this program today to be a concept of hope. That it doesn't have to end in conflagration, as the Israelis are determined to do, and Iran along with it, because they do not trust anything we say or do. And then this latest thing in Switzerland, this latest comments from President Trump over the weekend. You better agree to this deal or Iran will cease to exist, and you might not make it back to Tehran alive. That's a war crime. Threatening death to diplomatic members if they don't agree with what you want? How the hell do you bring peace to a world when you've got world leaders saying stuff like Netanyahu and President Trump say? But that's what we have to do. We have to put a new international security architecture on the table, and development is a very important part of that. You don't just stop shooting. You bring in the cement and the 2x4s and go back to work. And that's kind of what I'm concerned about. Rather than speculating whether the MOU is all theater and charade and try to keep money flowing into the coffers of the defense industry and to the pockets of AIPAC and the Israeli First Zionist takeover of our government. Without, whether speculating if this is a charade or not, it's a completely futile. So, my urgent appeal to all the listeners this morning. These are the things that need to be put onto the table. Mutual development. How many of you are in business right now because you had a fantastic idea, but you didn't have the money to fund it, and you found somebody who believed in your idea and funded it, and now you're equitable partners, and your life is better off because of it? There was a couple other things I wanted to cover this morning. What time is it? Oh, just a few minutes left. I wanted to talk about the new leader of Turning Point USA, a 100% Zionist, Brad Parscale, who's taken over. It's just, there are those who believe Charlie Kirk was killed because of his anti-Zionist statements the last few months of his life, and because he would not take Zionist money to expand his organization, in return espouse Zionist ideas. Now they have Brad Parscale, the former chief of staff for President Trump's 2020 presidential campaign, maybe the largest lobbying contract in the history of foreign influence operations in the country right now. But an avowed 100% Zionist is now taken over Turning Point USA. And then I also wanted to mention Tulsi Gabbard's biolab files are starting to rewrite the Ukraine narrative. Remember when we got left here? Remember when she first came out about this? It was all conspiracy theory. But when you have to look at almost everything that's going on right now against the backdrop of the Epstein revelations and the earlier debates over Metabiota and Hunter Biden as to what was going on in the Ukraine. Tulsi Gabbard's final weeks as Director of National Intelligence might well end up defining her entire political legacy. Because on June 12th, less than 2 weeks ago, when she left office, she announced the declassification of intelligence materials detailing U.S. taxpayer funding for more than 120 biological laboratories spread across 30 different countries, including dozens of facilities in the Ukraine. And according to the official briefing released by the Office of the DNI, these laboratories were linked to a broad network involving U.S. government agencies, contractors, universities, and partner states. Universities in our country doing work that in our country would be illegal and send them to prison for the rest of their life. They're actively involved with this operation in foreign countries that are being paid off to allow them to develop biological weapons of mass destruction. And so, as soon as she released that information, which restored my hope in the fact that she does have some integrity left in her heart, reignited one of the most contentious debates pertaining to the Ukraine conflict, because for years any mention of U.S. biolabs in the Ukraine was routinely dismissed by the Western press as nothing more than Russian propaganda or internet conspiracy theories. Yet this newly declassified material confirms the existence of a substantial American-funded laboratory network complete with Pentagon involvement, millions of dollars in infrastructure spending, and research that, of course, is devoted for the development of very dangerous pathogens. As I said earlier, I wanted my program today to be a voice of hope. And I thought maybe I could stretch it out and end with the Pope's insistence, along with the Confucianist idea that love can be an act of will. You don't have to be born with the ability to love. I think we all are, until it's brought under control by unloving influences. But I had to fill up the rest of the program. Excuse me, I just have a little congestion I've gotten over yet. But Gabbard framed the issue in unusually blunt terms. She was accusing the Biden administration officials and figures like Anthony Fauci of bold-faced lying about the existence and scope of these programs. And the released records that she released here less than 2 weeks ago described projects involving pathogens like anthrax, tularemia, Ebola, Marburg, SARS, MERS, plague, and others, being developed in such a way that instead of a few people being infected and dying, massive amounts of the population, because these, through the gain of function, become tremendously more dangerous. And one case reportedly concerned a Pentagon-funded veterinary laboratory in Kharkiv containing hundreds of pathogen samples, while other documents identify the engineering giant Black and Veatch, maybe it's Vetch, as a key contractor for laboratory construction and upgrades across Ukraine. And the timing, of course, is rather interesting, because in recent days, the controversy erupted over reports alleging that the CIA had seized MK-Ultra related materials from Gabbard's office, amid some broader disputes over declassification powers and intelligence oversight, especially on the part of the CIA. And coincidentally or not, she announced her resignation very shortly thereafter. She has not yet formally left office. She remains in there for a transition period, retaining the authority to push through disclosures that many in Washington would probably have preferred that she keeps under wraps. Remember, your elected government in Washington isn't there to protect you in your God-given inalienable rights. They're there to carry out the business matters of their donor class if they want to stay in their job. You saw what happened to Thomas Massey. All right, I will pick this up tomorrow. All is not lost. We're hoping for a speedy decision to be made for peace in the Middle East so the straits can open up and you won't be paying $10 a gallon for gas by August. There's more I could have said about the oil reserves. I didn't get to it. I'm going to stop the recording here at K-Talk. But I've got at least 2, maybe 3 spots open this week for new patients. I mean, if you've got agonizing pain, you can't stand up straight, you can't walk without a limp, you've got headaches that won't stop, you might want to sit down with me for half an hour and talk about it. But you need to schedule it. You call 801-523-1890. And let's see if I can't help you, because that half off special is still running. So keep your wits about you. But let's all learn to love a little bit better. I'll see you all tomorrow.